one of the things that comes down from the mountain, let's say in religious stories, is also compassion. Without the hierarchy, is it possible for there to be compassion? Because compassion is also the manner in which we accept that nothing ever reaches the ideal, that we can recognize it, but we also know that it's always kind of beyond us. And so there is a sense that it's judging us, but there's also a sense in which it kind of yields because, every glass is imperfect and everything, every house is imperfect, every building, everything that we notice, we can also see that it doesn't reach that ideal. I don't know if you ever thought about that a little bit.
Well, let me think about that for a second.
We've never talked about compassion before, so.
Yeah, well, when I think about compassion, first of all, I do not believe that compassion is an untrammeled moral virtue. And I think one of the terrible things about our society, one of the deadly Oedipal things about our society, is that we've put compassion in the highest place unthinkingly. And compassion is for infants. And I really mean that technically. So, if imagine that your ethic was that you were 100% compassionate. Okay, so what are you like? Well, you're like a good mother with a child under 6 months of age. Because human babies are born premature in some fundamental sense. So, the average gestation period for a mammal of about our size should be 2 years. And so our babies are born radically premature. And there's complex reasons for that. One is that there's an evolutionary arms race between the circumference of the infant's head and the dimensions of the pelvic hole through which the baby has to pass to be born. And if the pelvis of women was any wider, they couldn't run. And if it was any narrower, then the child would die, like many children did, right? The human birth mortality rate was abysmal right up till about, certainly 100 years ago. And then babies' heads are compressible, right? The bones aren't fully formed when they're born, and often kids are born and their heads are cone-shaped because they've been subject to such pressure during birth. And so it's a narrow needle to thread, and there's been a lot of evolutionary tinkering to get that right. Now, why in the hell did I say that?
You're talking about compassion.
sorry, I just lost my place. No, compassion,
right.
Yes.
We're talking about the excess of compassion.
Yes. Sorry about that. So our infants are born unbelievably helpless, and they are basically prenatal until they can crawl, and that's 7 or 8 months. And so prior to that, because they're so utterly helpless, everything they do has to be regarded as above moral reproach and 100% right. And so if you have an infant who is crying, who's 6 months old or 4 months old, your job is not to judge the infant or to punish the infant or to discipline the infant. It's like the infant has a problem, and all of your attention is to be focused on solving that problem. Period. 100%, that's it. And that's great for people who are under 6 months. But it's deadly. It's increasingly deadly as the child matures, because that kind of all-encompassing, I will do everything for you, is also the enemy of development. And that's the whole Freudian nightmare. That's what Freud put his finger on, and he knew that that was the pathology of the age, the Oedipal mother. And it's like, welcome to the age of the Oedipal mother, everyone, because that's certainly what we see now. And so if you put compassion in the highest place, well, then that's what you have a state of being where everything is an infant. And the only hallmark of ethic is pity. Now, Jung talked about classic conceptions of what is in the highest place. God, he said, God rules with two hands, mercy and justice. And that's that discrimination. You know how bad discrimination is. It's like, no, it's not. It's differentiation. It's judgment. It's putting things in their proper place. It's setting the highest above the lowest. It's formulating a pathway for further development. And, a mother might say, you're just fine the way you are. But what's that to say to someone who's, 10? It's like, you're not fine the way you are. You're 10. You got a lot of growing up to do, and you're probably not fine the way you are when you're 20. It's like, you're just a fraction of what you could be. And if it's all maternal compassion, and I mean that in the symbolic sense, it's all maternal compassion, it's, where's the impetus for development? And there's no judgment there. And I think the most dismal thing you can tell 18-year-old boys in particular, especially if they're miserable, is, well, you're just okay the way you are. And they're not, first of all, and no one thinks they are, including them. Well, they don't. No one gives a damn about malfunctioning 18-year-old boys. Like, but you can say, with the proper admixture of justice and mercy, it's like, yeah, well, you're not so bad for 18, and you could be way more, and good for you, and then you can encourage that, and that's the spirit of justice, and that's a patriarchal spirit fundamentally. Right. It's the encouragement and the calling forth of further development. And so
you could see it like in terms of we bring it back to something very very technical, which is walking down the street. And so I'm walking from this point to that point, and there is a perfect way which I could get there. But if I do that, I might spend all my time trying to figure that out, and I might not even be able to move. There's also a manner in which I could go anywhere and fall over. So there has to be, even in almost every act of perception, that right hand and left hand that you talked about.
Right.
That mercy and justice has to be part.
There has to be allowance for imperfection and error. Well, also orientation towards the aim. Yeah, and getting that balance right. Well, that's part of what consciousness does, I would say, is it constantly adjudicates between those two higher order principles. Now, those aren't the only principles, and there's no final solution to that, right? You can't just say, well, we're all compassionate and we're done with it. It's like, no. And it's an ongoing problem, right? With your kids, you're always wondering, they make a mistake. It's, well, how much do you forgive them? And how much do you say, how about you don't do that again? It's really embarrassing. It's terrible for you. If you replicate that error, your life is going to be a bloody catastrophe. You're old enough to figure it out. It's like, clue in. And you might say, well, who loves the child more? The one who says, oh, it's okay, everything you do is lovely, which it isn't. Or the person who says, you could do better. And, the answer is, well, it's a discussion between those two viewpoints constantly, because, and in your relationship with yourself, it's like, how much do you forgive yourself? And the answer certainly is 0. It's not 0. No one can live without being able to forgive themselves to some degree. But by the same token, you don't want to let yourself off the hook for every idiot error you make. And because that just doesn't work, because there are real errors, and
there are real consequences.
Yes, for you and other people. Right. And there's the real, which we're all wondering about now. This is one of the things that I think is quite comical, and I talked to Dawkins about this. Is the rationalists, the scientists, the atheists, and the postmodernists as well really took the idea of the divine to pieces, and even in the dismissive way that you see with someone, say, like Harris, although, like I said, he has his meditation and he dwells in the realm of the sacred. He just leaves it ineffable, right? And doesn't ritualize it, doesn't turn it into any kind of intellectual creed. And I think he does that because if he turned it into an intellectual creed, his rationality would just tear it to pieces. And so then he would have nothing, in any case, we've dispensed with the idea of the sacred transcendent, let's say, and that's the hard-headed way of thinking about the world. But what the reductive atheists didn't quite figure out was the Dostoevskian problem. It's like, well, if there's no God, everything is permitted. Well, how about we don't believe in objects anymore? Well, that won't happen. It's like, yeah, really, that won't happen, eh? What makes you think that, do the Buddhists believe in objects? Not really. The world's Maya, it's illusion. There's no transcendent material world. That's a Western idea. And I really think it came out of, partly Greece, but certainly came out of ideas that are associated with the logos on the logic side and on the religious side. It's like there's a transcendent world. It's material, but it's a transcendent world. You can't just do any old thing. You will be, the objective world will object to what you're doing. And so then it's an inexhaustible source of corrective wisdom. And it's the realization of that, in some sense, that's the precondition for science. You have to believe that before you can be a scientist. There's a reality out there that transcends your knowledge. And the postmodern types, technically, they just rejected that completely. They collapsed ontology, which is the study of being, let's say, into epistemology. It said, no, it's all words. It's like, oh, I see. So we stopped believing in God. Now we stop believing in the object. And if you're wondering why the DEI types are taking on the STEM people, if you haven't noticed that, and are going to win, by the way, It's because they don't believe in the objective world. What the hell do you need scientists for? You know, there's no objective reality. It's just whim. People can't believe that. It's like, that's what people have believed for most of time. And what do you mean they can't believe that? You mean till the bridges start falling down? They'll just blame that on insufficient diversity. Yeah, it'd be funny if it wasn't true.